So the starting point for this discussion was the announcement made last year by Prime Minister David Cameron. Excuse me. And he said that the government was going to put aside £50 million worth of public money to commemorate the centenary of the First World War next year. He said, and I quote, "Our duty towards these commemorations is clear: to honour those who served, to remember those who died, and to ensure that the lessons learned live with us forever." The last part bears repeating, I think. To ensure that the lessons learned live with us forever. Now what I'm interested in is, what are these lessons? What does that mean? And are these lessons and questions settled in any way? Now there seem to be at least two contradictory narratives about the First World War, at least two. One of it is that it was a just war, that we can view with triumph and pride. And one of it is another one is of tragedy, waste, sorrow, best exemplified, I suppose, by the war poets. Now, I'd like today's discussion to tease out if this is the case, or whether the truth lies somewhere else altogether, or there's another way of looking at this. In addition, contrary to the idea of critics that the centenary is in danger of promoting a kind of patriotism, blinking patriotism really, and jingoism, I think the approaching centenary promises, it's kind of gone right across the board. The Heritage Lottery Fund has just recently announced that it's giving nearly £100,000, for example, to the Peace Pledge Union, much to their surprise, I think, it must be said. And that kind of doesn't necessarily tick the gung-ho box, so what is really going on here? As I see it, there's a number of sensitivities about how other nations are involved in these centenary commemorations, in particular that of Germany. There's a lot of talk around about reconciliation as well. And my question is is this going to be a politically correct commemoration of the First World War? So to work out what's going on this evening, I'm really delighted to introduce you to the three historians on our panel. On my right is Hugh Strawn, Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford. He's the author of a number of books about the First World War, including the one that kind of gave me all the background to the history, and has a book being published this December titled The Direction of War, Current Strategy in Historical Perspective. And he's also got two illustrated histories, I think, of the First World War coming up next year. He's a member of the Government's Advisory Board, which is the National Committee for the Centenary of the First World War. And Hugh is considered to be one of the world's leading authorities on the First World War, so I'm really pleased that he's here this evening. He's come down from Scotland. Thanks, Hugh. Good to see you. On my right here, I've got Paul Lay, who's the editor of History Today, the magazine. History Today's aim is to present serious and authoritative history to as wide a public as possible, which is a wholly admirable aim in my book. Paul's also a writer, and amongst other things, and he also runs an annual seminar on public history at the University of London. He's very involved in the discussion about public understanding of and public engagement in historical debates and history. And also on my left, I've got Kevin Rooney. He's head of social science and deputy head of the sixth form at Queen's School in Hertfordshire and a history teacher. Kevin chaired a really lively session at last year's battle that I was at about whether to wear a poppy or not. Kevin is a Celtic fan, I thought I'd get that in before he does, and he's the founder of Fans for Freedom. So before we go any further, can we have a round of applause for the speakers? Everybody knows the score by now, so I'm not going to go into the rules and regulations and yellow cards and all of that. But I'm just going to go on and ask the speakers to present for between 5 and 7 minutes. Hugh.
Right. First thing is to say, when you gave us an alternative between is this a just war, is it a futile war, the answer is, it depends where you sit. It's both those things. It's not an either-or question, that. For some people, clearly it is futile. For some people, it is clearly a just war. And it seems to me the essence of the centenary is controversy. That is the best educational tool we have. The Prime Minister has spoken a lot about legacy. It's not at all clear he knows what legacy is or he's thought about what he means by it, but it's a word he's used a lot. And what I'd like to do in these few minutes is just think a bit about what a legacy might be. in order to understand that, I think we have to realise that every generation has had its own version of the First World War. In 1918, when the war ended on the 11th of November, people were caught in this country between conflicting emotions. Were they to commemorate those who had died, or were they to celebrate the fact the war was over, that it had been won? And the answer, of course, is they did both. And the 11th of November carried, for a long time, both celebration of the armistice and commemoration of the dead. We've loaded it more with the second of those things today, but in the 1920s, there was a real ambivalence present in that commemoration and that anniversary. In 1928, 10 years after the end of the First World War, Douglas Haig had just died. The funeral was a massive occasion. He lay in state and thousands poured past his coffin because he was a national hero. In the very same year, All Quiet on the Western Front, which defines another version of the war for us, was first published and generated a great deal of controversy. And we're beginning to see, if you like, a shift in perspectives reflecting the passage of the 10 years. By 1964, we're into a different position with the 50th anniversary, when the poles between those two positions, the poles that are, I see, is very much a British debate. It's extraordinary how no other country has hung up on this debate, had boiled down to one of good generals or bad generals, futility on the Western Front, focused entirely on the British experience on a very narrow sector of that front. John Terraine had written a book called Haig, the Educated Soldier, I beg your pardon, which itself was a challenge. And against that were productions like Oh, What a Lovely War, wonderful theatre. I remember going to the Joan Littlewood production, just showing my age, and the Alan Clark's book, The Donkeys, which of course is self-explanatory in terms of titles. The challenge for us, as we come up to this centenary, 100 years on, is are we going to be caught up in a 1964 debate, which is where much of what we think the current controversy is centred on, or are we going to move on? Are we going to be able to have a fresh debate so that by 2018 we look at this war in new ways and we do fresh things with it? And my short answer to that is if we don't move on, these next 4 years are going to be a complete waste of time. They're going to be tiresome, repetitive, deeply attritional, if I can use an emotive word. How do we make it change? What's very striking to me is that a great deal of what is happening across the country, and I think we need to remember that when the Prime Minister delivered his speech, he was reflecting the fact that a great deal was already going on at local level in small groups across the country, and he was trying to respond to a pressure from below. It was a sort of big society moment. That a great deal of that is micro in its approach. It is focused on family history, it is focused on communities, it is focused on particular regiments. What I fail to see, what I don't see, speaking as a historian of the war, is any sense of where that fits, of what the context is. And the big challenge is going to be how do we flip all that wide and genuinely felt public enthusiasm into a fresh narrative. And I think it can be done in two ways. The first is that, almost by definition, if any of you here have a relative who served in the First World War, chances are that particular relative survived. Now, you may think that's unusual. I'm sure you also may have relatives who were killed or wounded. But if that relative survived, that would actually be the norm. 88% of those who put on uniform in the British and Commonwealth Armed Forces, Empire Armed Forces in the First World War, survived the war and came home. Because our memory of this war is so mediated by the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and by village war memorials and school war memorials, we fail to realise that the majority came home. So if people begin to realise that actually their ancestors' experience was different, not contradictory, different, then they can begin, it seems to me, to put together a different story. If they realise, for example, that great-grandfather served and survived, served perhaps in the Royal Navy rather than the British Army, or served in the British Army in Mesopotamia, Iraq as we would now call it today, rather than on the Western Front, or that their great-grandmother worked in a munitions factory, or had a clerical job in the War Office, then we begin, I think, to open ourselves out to the possibility of different narratives. And that seems to be the first thing that can happen. The second thing that I think gives us hope for a real legacy, a legacy from the legacy, if you like, is that this war is the bad war. The Second World War has become the good war. It's, despite the fact that it lasted much longer, far more people were killed, not in the United Kingdom, I have to say, roughly half the death toll in the Second World War compared with the First World War. Despite that, this is the good war whose moral imperative is unquestioned, as though in 1939 Britain went to war in order to save the Jews. Sadly, that's not the case. Britain did not go to war to save the Jews. Britain, as in 1914, went to war very largely for balance of power interests, for concerns about small nations on the other side of Europe. Extraordinary parallel in some ways between the outbreak of the two world wars as far as this country is concerned. It becomes therefore very difficult to use the Second World War to ask any of the important questions about the position of war today, war in international relations, war in how we understand it. On the other hand, the First World War, precisely because it carries an ambivalence for us and a controversy for us, is a much better tool for asking ourselves questions which are deeply pertinent in 2013, which is, when is it right to go to war? When is it just to go to war? What are the circumstances that carry on fighting, even when the casualty bill is mounting? And that in itself, of course, can provide an imperative for continuing rather than ending. So I would see the educational moment as lying in our capacity to use the relationship between this war and our own predicaments and extend it forward, rather than use the legacy in a sense of looking backwards, which is how I feel the Prime Minister is thinking.
Thank you, Hugh. Perfect. Paul, would you like to go next, please?
Well, I don't disagree with anything, I think, that Professor Straw has just said. So I won't go over and try and reinforce that argument. I shall try and make some examples of how I think we could educate people, engage people, involve people in an argument. After all, that's what history is, the endless argument. It would be strange, I think, to commemorate the beginning of any war, even one which we see as a battle between good and evil, though that's more difficult to argue now, such as the Second World War. The First World War, with all its complexities, even more so. But it too would be perverse not to acknowledge the sacrifice Britain and its empire made at the time in the struggle against what I would see as the aggression of the Central Powers, powers that were mired, particularly Germany, in a militarism that I think reaches back centuries. And I think this anniversary also, and this is reinforcing what you said, also presents an opportunity for historians to engage with the public and present the debates that rage around the Great War, particularly its origins, in all its complexities, to engage in a public argument over its origins, but also its course and its legacy. The 50-year view, as I would call it, of "Oh, what a lonely war," of Aaron Clark's Lions Led by Donkeys, which has been perpetuated for another generation by Blackadder, remains the dominant narrative. Indeed, there seems to be some evidence that the British public demands this view of the conflict. History, I would argue, as a comfort blanket and as a therapy. It's not a situation that any serious historian should feel comfortable about. But one part of those 50-year commemorations, those of 1964, remains illuminating, I think. The BBC series The Great War, which I have watched recently, and it's a remarkable work, deeply affecting, and not least because the men and women, they are predominantly men, but also women, who were in it are relatively young. They're in their 60s, some of them, and lucid. What's really striking about the documentary when one watches it is that almost none of these people are named. Their names don't appear in the captions. The participants of the song and the Ypres, they're not there. It is as though the event, this event of the Great War, that they called the Great War, dwarfs them, as indeed it does. And one of the worries that I have about our commemoration 50 years on from 50 years on is that we will make the war about us rather than about the war itself. It would be all about me. Now, we should engage with this because I would argue, and it's not just me that argues this, that it is the greatest, most important event of the 20th century. It is, in Richard Evans's words, the seminal catastrophe. All else follows from it. When I was at school, I would imagine doing O-level history, the Russian Revolution would have been considered the great event of the 20th century. It isn't now. The Russian Revolution would not have happened but for the Great War. There would have been no rise of Hitler without the Russian Revolution. Without the rise of Hitler, there would have been no Holocaust. And to understand its origins, I think there's another opportunity to delve further back in time than just the July crisis and the events of the early 1900s. As an early modernist, I would argue that we search the early civil wars of these islands for the origins of British distrust and mistrust of a standing army, for example. We must examine the almost pathological passion of Frederick William of Prussia for his military and the ruthlessness with which his inheritance was deployed by his son Frederick the Great. We must understand too the passions unleashed and made real by the French Revolution and the creed of the rights of man. It is, after all, as Michael Howard points out, one of the great ironies of British history that a parliament that with some reason could claim to be the first to represent a new mass electorate, and a government that far more than those of Gladstone embodied all the ironical aspirations of John Bright and Richard Cobden, should be the one that took Britain into the most terrible and costly war in its history. We probably won't achieve a greater, richer understanding of this epochal conflict by focusing, as I fear we will, predominantly on the vagaries of family history, oral history and the like, with all their insularities and the very real danger of solipsism. Neither will we commemorate it or understand this conflict by being fearful of the response of other countries, such as Germany. They must come to terms with their own past, and judging by the last 64 years, it is something that Germany is rather good at. I would argue perhaps it is somewhat better at doing it than we are. I've been interested in the work of Vernon Bogdanor's new research on the origins of the First World War. It's a serious shift of focus from his career as a constitutional historian, and though I think it does owe something to the series of talks given by the aforementioned Michael Howard at Oxford in the mid-1980s, which were published as the Lessons of History. Disraeli, he points out, and this is quite well known, said the importance of the German Revolution, German reunification, was recognised early, and he claimed that it was a more important event than the French Revolution, and one that would have greater ramifications, particularly for England. It is a fact of British history that it is the mavericks who have recognised the threat to Germany and other powers rather than the mainstream. Perhaps one needs a little bit of the devil in one to recognise the devil in others. Disraeli, who is often accused of being an opportunistic charlatan in domestic affairs, had a sharp mind for foreign policy. But it was only during the early years of the 20th century that Britain really confronted the reality of the growth of continental militarism. It is no coincidence, for example, that Professor Strawn's Oxford Chair in the History of War was inaugurated in 1909, when there was great concern about German ideas, whether that was their engagement with Hegel and Darwin in chemistry. There was this idea that here was a continent surpassing the great power. Some figures, such as Lord Esher, Colonel Maud, Lords Milner and Lord Roberts, Frederick Roberts, whose National Service League, founded in 1902 in the wake of the Boer War, were the damned fools at odds with the greater mass of wise men. But it may have been the damned fools who were right. One of the most remarkable facts of the First World War is that Britain did not introduce conscription until 1916. By 1918, the war was won. One of the greatest achievements, perhaps the greatest achievement in the British Army's history. Had Britain listened to its damned fools and created a mass citizens' army in the 1900s or early 1910s, would Germany have attacked France via Belgium? It seems unlikely to me. Could it be that the First World War resulted in part because Britain was not militaristic enough? It's worth a debate, and it's the kind of debate we should have 100 years on, but I fear we will not.
Thank you, Paul. That's kind of an interesting position, I think. Yeah, which was in there. Right, Kevin. Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm smiling to myself because I'm in the company of absolute heavyweights in terms of history, and there's me, a mere teacher who taught A-level history, and actually doesn't even teach it at the moment. So I'm very humble. I'm genuinely humble, and I'm genuinely humble because what I'm going to say, I'm throwing it out in the spirit of thinking out loud, and you can put me right and pull me up and tell me that I'm wrong or right. But I suppose I get a bit of confidence from the fact that I think that the debate about the centenary is not a historical debate, it's actually a political debate. And I think that the debate today is about today, and it's not really about 100 years ago. That might sound a bit silly, but I think that's true. And final little point before I go to my 4 points in 4 minutes. I want to make a distinction between academics and scholars who are studying history and what you might call the popular imagination, because I'm about to make my first point, which is this. I think that we here in Britain find it difficult to endow history with any type of meaning. And I think that our connection, for example, to World War I is unclear. And now that the generation that fought in that war, the last of them died off, I think we don't really have any sense of historical causality. And when I say that, I'm talking about the average person in the street. And I'll give you a good example of that. I find the blurb for this session, the Battle of Ideas brochure, really interesting, because the question is, one of the questions is, what would be the meaning of the centenary commemoration? And meaning is organic. It emerges from society, and the fact that we have to ask that about the centenary tells me something. It tells me that there's not that sense of historical transaction taking place from one generation to the other, and that we don't have that sense of, if you like, that historical web of meaning. There's a sort of disconnect, if you like, and I think that's worth exploring. Let me give you an example to maybe draw that out, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. Ask a young person, why do they wear the poppy? I seen the first poppy of the year yesterday. It was downstairs. And you'll get a puzzled silence. And then what you'll then get is 100 different explanations. And they'll probably say it boils down to some sense of awareness or remembrance. They'll say something like that. And they might mention the First World War, they might not, because now the poppies come to me sort of all complex that British military engaged in. And if you actually ask to view World War I find you usually get silence. And then, if it's not a silence, it'll be the line, it was lands led by donkeys. It'll be the hate point that people were all, sent over the Somme and so on to their death. But generally, to be frank, they don't really have a clue as to why they're wearing a poppy. And then, it's almost as if the poppy and it's not even just young people, increasingly it's older people, it's akin to wearing an AIDS ribbon, a red ribbon, or a yellow wristband for Make Poverty History. And that's interesting. I mean, I'm interested in that. There's something going on. And it seems to me that, there's just no real sense of history or historical imagination of what the First World War was about. So that was that point. Let me go to a completely separate point. I have to talk about Ireland because I'm from Ireland. And it's got to do with the fact that in Ireland, we're just hitting a decade of centenaries. And you've got the 200,000 Irish men who fought for Britain in the First World War. And then you've got the Easter Rising of 1916 and the Irish War of Independence 1918 to 21. And the Irish government has decided that it wants to combine all of these anniversaries together. It wants to bring them all under one umbrella. And that's fine. It wants to do it for various reasons, peace, reconciliation, and so on and so forth. But here's the contrast. It really shines a light in World War I, and the question I ask, you may think it's an illegitimate or simplistic question. Where's the heroes? Where's the heroes of World War I? What was it about? I mean, if you ask me about 1916, I can tell you about my heroes, of James Connolly or Padraig Pearse. Or if you ask me about the Irish War of Independence, I can tell you about my heroes, Tom Barry and Michael Collins, and so on and so forth. I won't bore you with a long list. But the proposal to commemorate these different anniversaries together really shines a light on what I think is the moral confusion around World War And I do think that is a question worth tackling. Now, let me go on again to make this point. Why is that happening in Ireland? And I think it's got very little to do with 1916 or World War I. It's got to do with history being reduced to the prism of contemporary preoccupation. And the contemporary key preoccupation in Ireland at the moment is the peace process in the north of Ireland. And so what you get under the guise of the politics of reconciliation, you get a collapsing of the moral distinction between the morality or legitimacy of World War I and the Irish War of Independence. Now, for a moment, I'm not actually concerned about people's different views. We can have an argument about the morality or legitimacy of either. The more interesting point is that the average person in the street, I would argue, would see a huge big difference in Ireland between those two things. They would be very much see the people of 1916 as heroes, but the people of World War I who fought for Britain, not as particularly as heroes. So we have a situation under promoting community relations, the cement and peace process. We have, and I'll quote you in the questions and answers, their actual speeches, the President Michael D. Higgins, the Taoiseach and the Kennedy, the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister Eamon Gilmore, the British-Irish Parliamentary Group, all making the point that the centenary must be used, and historians have a duty. Historians have a duty to promote peace and reconciliation. And anybody who doesn't make that moral equivalence between these things is an extremist. So when the number one artist in Ireland, Robert Balla, turned around and disagreed with the collapsing of these different events into one, he was labelled a wrecker of the peace process, an extremist and an enemy of peace. I have to skip the rest about the manipulation of history here for contemporary political purposes, but to finish in one point, I see the same trend here in Britain when I start to hear the German ambassador and politicians talking about how this is an opportunity to promote European integration, European solidarity and harmony, etc., etc. And therefore, let's not talk about who the winners and the losers were. Let's not talk about causality who caused the war. Interesting stuff, but a problem.
Thanks, Gavin. Sorry you couldn't complete that. I'd like to go back to that. I think that's a really key question. And the first thing I'd like to ask before I go back to the floor is reconciliation, Kevin, not an honourable aspiration within the context of the centenary? I mean, reconciliation is what's wrong with that?
It's a good question. Actually, it's a very good. Of course, reconciliation is a very desirable thing. But I suppose I'm saying I don't think it's a job of historians to be playing that game. And you may think I'm stretching the point, but there's a real danger here where historians are effectively being drawn into what is a project of social engineering, and they're actually potentially being manipulated. Now, at the moment it was all the politicians that I quoted. So I'm not actually pointing the finger at historians here, but I am saying that it is the desire of the politicians to try to use history for what is a more contemporary issue. So I'm all into reconciliation, but I do have a problem if it means twisting or marginalising or sidelining certain things in history which you think are problematic, Leslie.
Got you. Paul, you got something to say on that reconciliation?
Well, I'd agree about the desirability of reconciliation, and the reconciliation between Britain and Germany has been somewhat easier than that between Britain and Ireland over time, although the last decade or so has been relatively positive. On the issue of the poppy, I can see its contention from an Irish perspective, absolutely, from someone who's married to an Irish woman. I know full well what those ramifications are, and I dislike immensely the parading of poppies come about October the 25th under the EBC in various places. That was certainly not the way it was when I was a child. But I think one of the reasons for that is because, and this is from a very English perspective, and it was a point made yesterday by Matthew Paris in the Times, is that the English don't really think of themselves, or haven't really thought of themselves as victims. And victimhood is actually a rather fashionable, desirable thing these days. So I think there's an element, and this is thinking aloud somewhat, that the First World War has been manipulated so that it becomes one aspect where the English, and I use that word advisedly, can think of themselves for once as victims of history.
Okay, English as victims of history, that's a new thought for me. Hugh, on this point of reconciliation, I know that you've been speaking with the German contingent in Europe about the centenary and their concerns about the commemorations. I wonder whether, first of all, you might want to speak about the reconciliation, but...
Well, I think the reconciliation issue is alive for some communities and not for others. Actually, in terms of Anglo-German relations, the First World War is not really an issue, is it? Quite, you know, we've got the Second World War, we've got over that. except for the Daily Mail, we've got over it. But the rest of us have got over it. I really don't think debates about 1914 and whether Germany is guilty of causing the First World War are actually going to produce a rupture in Anglo-German relations. And the sensitivity of Germany is, it seems to me, due to a very particular phenomenon, which is that the argument that Germany caused the war, which went out of fashion in the 20s and 30s after the Versailles Treaty had accused them of war guilt, then came back into fashion in the 1960s, is now, broadly speaking, accepted within Germany at a point where it's gone out of fashion again in Britain and in other countries. What they're reflecting is an internal angst for them, which is, how do we deal with this war, which is a long time ago, which we haven't thought much about, which was fought by a regime which fell in 1918, and which can at the same time be put in a continuum of German history that goes back to 18th century Prussia that Paul mentioned, and runs forward to Hitler and the Nazis. So it is part of their internal debate rather than part of our debate with them, quite frankly, and they've got to sort their own story out and come to grips with it, because they haven't been thinking much about it. They have been thinking rather a lot about the Second World War. As far as other parts of the world are concerned, and indeed, I mean, Kevin's mentioned the most immediate one for us, which is Ireland, this war is deeply divisive, still, in a way that it's not necessarily divisive within Britain itself. And that applies, of course, most obviously to us today in the Middle East, but it applies in the Balkans, across the former areas of the Ottoman Empire. There are still unresolved issues which this centenary is going to have to deal with. And, I'm, as you heard just now, just come now from Scotland. On the 28th of June next year, Scotland has a big, big issue. Because long ago, it was decided, not by the Scottish Government, but the National Trust for Scotland, a non-partisan body, that they would commemorate the Battle of Bannockburn on that date. It also, of course, happens to be the anniversary of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And then, in their wisdom, and I honestly believe this is cock-up rather than conspiracy, the government in Westminster decided that Armed Forces Day, which is due to be held on the 28th of June also, should be held at Stirling, in other words, on the battlefield of Bannockburn. And you honestly couldn't, if this were Yes Minister, you would not actually say it was a credible plot. But it is what's happening. And even die-hard unionists within the referendum debate are saying, please, please, can we move Armed Forces Day 2 weeks either way, so we're not in this situation. So, yes, absolutely, historical events will become politicised, and certainly are being politicised as part of the referendum debate. And any hope we can separate those two things out, sadly, is naive, however much I would agree entirely with Kevin and with Paul that it's our job as historians to try and bring historical common sense to that. But it will be used for an EU agenda, and of course if we get a better EU as a consequence of that, and peace and harmony within the, and indeed the United Kingdom, to have my loyalties now, if the United Kingdom stays a union and stays within the European Union, I will regard that as a very good outcome. If the First World War is used for that agenda, I won't have any objection. I am allowed to say one thing about poppies while I'm banging.
I would like to say something about
Okay. The poppy was controversial even in the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, people bought white poppies to manifest their protest. The poppy is still controversial in Glasgow for exactly the same reason it's controversial in Ireland. It's a symbol of sectarianism, and we should see it in that guise. And one of the other controversy that surrounds it, which we don't tend to notice, is that actually, of course, it's also difficult for many of the current, in inverted commas, veterans community, because it links them implicitly with a war that was a very long time ago, that does not reflect their concerns and their preoccupations today. So, because we have manifested our regret about war, our sense of victimhood, to pick up Paul's point, through the use of the poppy, we have actually provided a direct and unbroken link between 1918 and 2013, which is unhelpful in some contexts as well as powerful in others.
Right, there's quite a lot going on up here, and I'd like to see if you'd like to ask a question of the panel or make a point. Because we've got about, not long enough. This woman at the front, please. Thanks. Just wait for the microphone, thanks. I don't mind if you don't stand up. I'm happy. If you want to sit down. It's the end of the day. Yeah. Sorry, just continue.
No, I'm just interested in just sort of picking up some of those threads. I think there was a really good distinction made between history as a scholarly practice and history in the popular imagination. And I think that the link between the two was much stronger. And I know when I was growing up, the World War I was actually a very live thing. It was there was still people alive, obviously, and the sort of debris of the Somme, that's what my dad used to call the guys who would see with limbs missing. We called them the debris of the Somme. And I remember it was a very live thing. And I think in the popular imagination, people had a sense of, Kevin, you said, who were the heroes of World War I? Well, at a time, I think, when left politics was much stronger and when there was a much stronger ideology, the heroes of World War I were the unknown soldier, were the working man, the everyman. And I think that you had a sense that it was an imperialist war and that these were the destruction of lives, of human potential, human capacity. That was the narrative. And in a sense, that narrative, which was in the popular imagination, and obviously it depended what side you sat on in terms of politics, did connect into the historical and more scholarly study of the war. And I think that's another thing I'd just like to say is that fighting the battles of the past, refighting the past in the present is not new. But I think what is different today is that when those battles around the meaning of the First World War were fought, they were refighting the past and also fighting the ideological battles of the present, and they embodied a vision for the future. And I think there's something different about today.
That's a good point. Thank you for that. One behind. I'm just going to take a few points from this group of people on this side and then.
I think we should remember this anniversary, but in that remembrance, we really need to understand the events of the First World War. And by understanding it, not through via tales of individual tragedy, however emotional and tragic they may be, but specifically historically. Just to give you an example of how much help I might need here and how much I myself, however unconsciously, have buried in English, British sensibility about it. I was in France in May. My parents are Catholic, they wanted to go to Mass. I asked around and said, yeah, you can go here for Mass, but it's Armistice Day and there will be a parade. And I was just like, no, that's November. Of course, they're not talking about the First World War, they're talking about the Second World War. So my question to the panel is, I'd like to know a little bit more about not just Germany and Britain, but other sensibilities in Europe. And also to pick up Kevin's point, and to be historically specific, who did cause it? Who caused it?
That's a good question. Who caused the war? Right, thank you. There's a gentleman behind you. I'll take a few and then I'll get the panel to respond and then we'll go out again.
Yeah, I sort of, like lots of other people, became interested through family history, that discovering diaries from that time of the people that fought a relation. Unfortunately, he didn't survive, died in northern France in 1917. But he'd actually been sort of served around the world, served in India, served in Burma, was involved in suppression of the Singapore Mutiny of 1915, and I got interested in it through those things. But what you find with people is that it is a sort of glorified personal identity search.
Yeah.
Because as soon as I've asked questions about the wider implications, the bigger story, if you like, people don't really want to follow that up. They're not really interested in that. It's just the personal story that they're interested in. I think just one point about General Haig, I thought that was interesting. I'll look that up. The celebration, because I think soldiers, what they felt, there was a duality to it. The duality was that they felt pride in having been a part of it, but also the sorrow. So therefore, perhaps Haig is seen for them as a symbol.
Thank you. One more question at the right at the very back. Actually. Oh, sorry. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
It might be slightly off the point that's already been made, but on a personal family level, I'm very interested in the centenary in terms of how conscientious objection is viewed, because certainly at a family distance it seems to have changed its definition over, it's almost like they were the ones who fully understood, and certainly the family is going to be very interested whether or not we can sort of probably join the party. So it's off the point to some extent, but obviously it's very much seems to be part of the First World War.
Thank you. Panel, would you like to respond to any or all of these points? Kevin, have you got?
I'm still scribbling the last point
Still
down
writing
there. Okay, so I think the very first person who spoke, I think completely know where she's coming from, and I agree with an awful lot of what she said. And the collapse, the causes in, although we don't have time to go into them, but when she makes the point about an imperialist war, that would be pretty much my explanation that, I would subscribe to Lenin's old theory of imperialism. Feel free to be challenged on that from the panel, we can get into the nitty-gritty, but I'm sure we'll be here 1 o'clock in the morning. Just on the poppy thing that the first person says, well, I remember, I've been in Britain a long time, I can remember the fierce arguments about the poppy. I remember all the left-wingers going down to Whitehall protesting and all the rest of it. And, and I can remember challenging people myself about the poppy, wanting to get into an argument with them. Now when you try to speak to somebody about the poppy, you challenge them to get into an argument about imperialism and anti-imperialism, it's like grabbing a bag of water. It goes away from you. People aren't interested in something that's fundamentally significantly changed, and I think to me it's that complete absence of ideas, of agency, of the vision of the future, all the things that were mentioned. When you don't have a clash of ideas or contestation, it seems as if these things become much less important, and I think that's what's happening in part of the First World War, and the poppy is a reflection of that. I think the point about understanding the war was an interesting question. I went to the debate, I won't spend long on this, and I thought the debate that the woman who asked the question was on the panel with Paul Lay. I think it's an interesting point that Paul was making yesterday about the problem of literature, and with literature, from historians, what you get is doubt, uncertainty, and they see that as a good thing, complexity. From literature, what you get is certainty, and that's a bad thing. I mean, that's an interesting debate, because you could accuse me of arguing for certainty in terms of the public imagination points I was making earlier. So it's an interesting discussion about education. I mean, I wouldn't say as a teacher, it's such a cheap point, but I would make it nonetheless that the education that our young people are getting, for example, on the history of the First World War, is appalling and atrocious. Throw them a couple of documents, a few source papers, and I won't go into that. That's a discussion.
All right,
Two other questions. Don't do it for the time being.
For a second, you can come back in a minute before you've got something to say on the question.
Well, I do agree very much about the conformism of the poppy, either one, for whatever reasons I may have, but I don't feel comfortable with the fact that the only person who, in public life, who actively opposes wearing one is Jon Snow. I think that kind of conformism is not what anyone was fighting for on this side. So I do worry about that, and that has got to do with the decline of ideology, the move into the middle ground. It's not just the lack of socialist or left-wing ideology, it's also the collapse of traditional Toryism as well. I also think that the reversion to that as well is that we've begun to look back for our myths, and I think this is again quite a specifically English thing, although maybe English-Welsh thing as well. It's very, very striking the impact, for example, that the opening ceremony of the Olympics had, in terms of trying to define a new aspirational sense of Britishness or something that was positive. You know, myths are often regarded as false history. I think that's an entirely wrong interpretation. There are myths that are entirely malign. One thinks of the myths that the Nazis peddled. But then there are others that can be viewed as beneficial. One thinks of the idea post-war of the New Jerusalem that was their idea. A land fit for heroes, to talk about the First World War there. It seems to me that politicians simply just cannot construct, but find it really difficult to construct those myths in a fragmented world at the moment, which I think is a problem, and I think it's why we tend to cling to the past on our myths in this country rather than look forward to them. And we could really escape from that. There's two other things, if I might briefly say this. I think it's very, very important that we take this opportunity to look at the First World War from a global perspective, that we realise just how many nationalities were involved, and the breadth of the breadth of participants just on the empire side in itself is extraordinary. But also to recognise the internecine conflicts there, most famously Gallipoli, of course, which will raise its head again in 2015.
Thank you.
Just following on from Paul's last point, I think the issue of whether this war is part of a continuity or whether it's part of a change is particularly revealed, if you like, by the sort of debate that Britain has about it. Britain, extraordinarily in the 20th century, didn't have a massive road crash in the way that France did, and that was referred to in 1944-45, in the way that Germany did, obviously, in 1945, in the way of the Second World War collectively was for much of Europe. And the consequence of that, of course, is that we have seen, one of the reasons we have gone back to the war more readily than many other European countries, I think, has been partly because of that sense of continuity and the sense of escape from the Second World War in relative terms. What that also means, though, is that for other nations, the way in which the First World War fits into a national story is also very different. For Turkey, the founding myth comes out of this war. Gallipoli for them is both a great victory and the moment when Ataturk, the founder of the Republic, comes to the fore. For the successor states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 1918 is a founding moment. There's then an inconvenient moment of Soviet occupation after the end of the Second World War and through the Cold War, but I think many will see 1918 as a moment of commemoration. Second point, just picking up this very interesting discussion about past, present and future and where we situate ourselves in how we use this war. Big part of it, I think, is what's happened in this country is that despite all the tendency of this discussion to draw a line between popular history and what historians do, which I think is absolutely a relevant distinction, an important distinction to bring out. But in spite of that, what I want to say is that the written word now so dominates in the way in which we understand the past. We're so bereft of an oral tradition, despite the influence of the war poets, because in a way they're the written word too, that we've created a distance between our own past and our present that is not so true for other countries. Where an oral tradition, even if it's beyond the lifetimes of the people who are talking about that tradition, remains alive. I mean, you've only got to go to less literate societies to see that. They will talk about wars in the past with an immediacy as though they're talking, it's a bit like a tradition from the Odyssey. It's been repeated by word of mouth, and therefore it has a validity and an excitement. I think that documentaries, even Blackadder, may have its role in creating that vision. Finally, if I can quickly say a word about France, as that was raised,
Just ask. Yeah.
and I'm on the French Scientific Committee, so I've sat through some of these debates too. I had imagined naively that 1914 was a great moment of national unity, because after all that is exactly how it was sold in the Third Republic, and is a moment when the divided republic came together, and France, whether you were of the left or the right, whether you were a churchman or whether you were violently against the church, whether you were for the army or against the army, united, particularly at Verdun in 1916. And I gather that is a right-wing plot, and that actually, if you're President Hollande, of course 1944-45 is much more important, because the Socialist Party refines itself through the French resistance, and liberation in 1944 is really is the defining moment. The fact, of course, that that reflects a split in France, and a split that carries through, which de Gaulle effectively has to deal with in the 50s and 60s, it shows in some ways how sort of later history is still very alive in France even today. And so next year, France is actually having 6 events between the 6th of June 2014 and the end of the Battle of the Marne, both moments that save France, 1944 D-Day, 1914, the moment when the French invasion is defeated, but where they will oscillate between 1914 and 1944. You may think we're in a confused position. You're going to be pretty confused if you're a Frenchman by September 1914. But September 2014.
Great. Now, can you put your hands up again, please? The people who wanted to, and I'll do this super quickly. Ronnie, you had your hand up, or have you had your question answered? Or?
Well, it was actually to do with the idea of victimhood, which kind of made me think about, because I wasn't brought up in this country, so my historic knowledge is very limited, and probably relying very much on watching Blackadder. But it's the idea of victimhood, and the way we see war now as every soldier who dies in Afghanistan is seen as a victim. Yeah. And that kind of links to the poppy. So now we're told you have to wear a poppy because it's no longer about the First World War. It's about everyone who dies in war. And also it's about patriotism. So if I, as a Muslim, choose not to wear a poppy, then it's seen as kind of being betraying the nation and being the alien within. But also that opposition to the poppy itself isn't actually based on fact either, because it's based on some kind of identity. So in a way we've kind of, I know you said that we need the events, but we seem to have believed that moment and reduced everything to these kind of caricature, cartoon way of looking at history, and it's also making us look in a very diminished way at our present. And it makes me fear how on earth we're going to report the present and the future.
Okay, that's a big question, that one. We've got about 7 minutes to go, I'm afraid. A question over there, please. You can make it very quick.
Just a quick question, I guess, to Kevin and Paul, thinking about, as the first question said, of course, the use of history for political purposes isn't new. Paul, you seem to be suggesting maybe that the British state will use the World War I to kind of create a new mythology. And I don't know if that's right. And Kevin, I'm wondering, what is the difference today? What is the kind of use of World War I? In this kind of post-political, non-historic context, what's going on with this?
Thank you. I mean, there was a few hands down here. Did you? No? No? There's a hand here. We'll get these couple of points and then I'll get the panel to respond.
Just 2 very quick points. I think we do need to, recognise the contribution of the Commonwealth forces, and I think there's been a certain, reluctance to do that because with the First World War, that you can see that the time when the British Empire starts to decline, and there's been a certain reluctance to discuss that, I feel. And I also think that in the First World War, the need to mobilise resources on this unprecedented scale, it's led to this great expansion of state power, and I think it'd be, really rewarding if we could see how that has led to, the government we have today and the role it has in our lives. So.
Good point. Thank you. And final, with the gentleman in front of you.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I was just going to ask a very brief question, if I can, on the educational role that the First World War continue to all have. As you mentioned, I was going to bring up as well, the Commonwealth has a huge part to play in the First World War. But actually, quite a lot of people know very little about what we take as accepted facts, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, for example. How much time do you think we should spend teaching the more global view of the First World War, and how much I'm just educating basic facts that many people still don't know.
Good question. I'm going to ask the panel to pick and choose as to what they respond. Kevin, would you like to go? I'm always going to you first. So.
You always come down every time, I think. The point about the use of history, well, this is really interesting. I was talking to Professor Paul Bew earlier today, and some other interesting guy. They were making the point that Britain was very different to most countries because it was very understated in its sort of nationalistic sentiment and so on. And I was just making the point to him that I absolutely disagreed with that, and maybe it's because of where I come from. But the point about history, you're right, Britain's always used history of wars and conflicts in a very jingoistic, nationalistic, militaristic way, contrary to what I think some people think. But in terms of today, how is Britain using it? First of all, I don't want to say that it's not like a conspiracy theory where they have this plan of action as to how they're going to use the First World War. But what strikes me is the absolute attempt to use World War I just close down any space for disagreement or contestation of any idea. And so when someone was asking about the conscientious objectives, for example, you get these group of people in Britain going, yeah, and what about the conscientious objectives? We're worried about this celebration is going to be all jingoistic and militaristic. And the Centenary Committee says, right, here's some money for you. Here, go on, do what you want with that around your particular plans. And it's just this sense that, Hugh could put me right on this because he's an absolute expert. But I just get the sense that the politicians, leading politicians from Camden down, want to do whatever will keep people quiet and will just close down any space for disagreement. And that is just interesting. It's interesting because it goes back to the very first point made from the floor about the fact in the past politicians had some sort of view of the future, some ideological vision, and that influenced how they looked at history in terms of how they used it for their own purposes. Whereas today, I just get the strong feeling that there isn't that sort of self-interest with the politicians, and they're just happy to close down the space where they think there's going to be a bit of aggro. I could be wrong, but that's what I think.
I think it's a proper case of don't mention the war. Paul?
I'll deal with the first question about myth. I wasn't suggesting for a moment that this current government would use the First World War to create any myth. Not only would that not be advisable, I don't think they'd be courageous enough to do that, or have the kind of certainty of vision to be able to do that. It would be quite astonishing. I was just simply making the point that the First and Second World Wars, and something like Remembering Sunday, fulfills the space in which politicians sometimes create more positive myths about the future. That's the point I was making there. Secondly, in terms of the literature, I think it's very important that people should study the literature of the First World War. We've seen the war poets, that's absolutely true, but we have a rather, it's nowhere as diverse as it should be. And I can think of a couple of works that I think are crucially important that show very different perspectives. David Jones's great poem In Parenthesis, which is one of the great studies and engagements with life, daily life on the Somme, which is largely from something approaching a pacifist perspective. And then from the other extreme is the remarkable work Storm and Steel, which is like a First World War Iliad by the German soldier Ernst Junger, who fought for the entirety of the war in a Hanoverian regiment from 1914 to 18, and seems rather to have liked it. And finally, I'd like to address the questions that were put by the woman in the front there about the global nature of this conflict and the way in which it changed our world in terms of governance, in terms of military industrial structure, everything. Those are exactly the sort of questions that there should be an opportunity to raise and to answer. I fear it won't be, but I would suggest that that is what we'll all try to bring to the fore.
Thanks, Paul. Finally, Hugh.
I've got to choose my words advisedly now, sitting on too many advisory committees. The first thing I would say is this centenary is going to be, I've said it already, going to be a long haul. We've already begun absurdly, thanks to publications, television, they're already there. And indeed, on the Imperial War Museum trustees, we've had a graph of what's planned and there's a sort of precipice in August 2014, because everyone's front-loading the whole thing to 2013-14. We've got 5 years from now, and there's plenty of time, it seems to me, for views to change in that period. Indeed, as I said at the beginning, they must, otherwise it's all going to be very repetitious and boring. One of the things I think that really will change, or where we will be confronted by 2018, is the point that was made at the back about Remembrance Sunday / Armistice Day, because I agree entirely that Remembrance Sunday is made to carry sort of contradictory messages. It's a national moment, it's a nationalistic moment, and at the same time it is a statement about universal grief about war. We shouldn't be doing this sort of thing, and isn't it awful? It's deeply paradoxical. But of course, at that level, we would say this, wouldn't we? It's a sort of traditional British compromise. You know, you can have it both ways. In 2018, we're going to struggle to have it both ways, precisely because the fact that the 11th of November will fall on a Sunday means that Remembrance Sunday and Armistice Day will be back together again, and will be commemorating a victory for Britain and the Commonwealth, as much as we're commemorating all those who died in war wherever they are, including those of the 21st century. I think, there is no government agenda, and I think I can say that quite clearly, having lived with the government agenda or absence of it for the last 2 years. And it is, there is no agenda about triumphalism, there is no jingoistic agenda, and to that extent, the cynics who say, well, they're responding to whoever that comes along, I mean, Kevin's point, to dampen it down, actually has more validity than any sort of deep conspiracy. What that means, of course, is that, coming back to the point raised about conscientious objection, is absolutely conscientious objectors are part of this story, not least, of course, because the recognition of conscientious objection was something unique to Britain, and a great, from that point of view, moment of, if you like, freedoms in political terms that was able to happen. So, you know, although we associate conscientious objection with those who are persecuted by this war, it also, of course, represents a triumph in terms of the fact that they were allowed to object conscientiously at all. So again, you know, there's quite a lot of unpacking, it seems to me, to be done with that story. Final point I would make, and it links again to the government issue and picks up the point about the Commonwealth. Absolutely, Britain goes into this war as an empire in 1914. And when on the 4th of August next year, we face up to the centenary, it will be the day after the closing of the Commonwealth Games. And the juxtaposition of those two events is something that has quite rightly exercised a lot of people who've been thinking about the centenary and where we should go with it. And it's been particularly difficult in Britain, because Britain is very anxious not to be seen as resurrecting some imperial vision which is no longer appropriate. But that has had a paradoxical effect, because, of course, Commonwealth countries have said, what are we doing about the centenary of the First World War? Because we were all in this. And London, of course, has been very concerned, absolutely, to address the fact that there will be people within this country, residents of this country, British nationals, whose forebears fought possibly for the forces of Commonwealth countries, and possibly for forces that were opposed to Britain in this war. Plenty of Germans who now have British citizenship and so on. And of course, this is everybody's war from that point of view, which comes back to our ability to use what we tend to see and will see as a British event, in Paul's terms, to see it as a global event, because absolutely it's a global event. But we must be ready to recognise that for our forebears, and I speak now wearing a British hat, between 1914 and 18, they fought this war as a Commonwealth or an imperial event. I mean, British officers who won the Victoria Cross, the challenge of Eric Pickles' great agenda to have VC winners, great I put in inverted commas because I don't really approve of it, to have VC winners commemorated on pavements in the towns where they were born, but of course a great many of them were born outside the United Kingdom, even if they served as Britons in British regiments, just as it applied the other way around. Plenty were born in Britain, but served in regiments that came from across the Commonwealth.
Right, we've compressed 100 years into just over an hour, and we've run over, I'm afraid. I'd just like you to thank the panel. Thank you very much.